For a secret process, there's a surprising amount we actually know about this Boulder grand jury. We know all of their names, we've seen some of their faces in this footage, but listen to this. The DA's involvement in this case was inappropriate. They interfered in the investigation by being roadblocks to getting things done. The DA's office did not want to do a grand jury until forced to. These are the words of Police Chief Mark Beckner. Also, former Denver prosecutor Craig Silverman said that Hunter bent over backwards to present both sides to the grand jury, an unusual step for the prosecutor in a murder investigation. Hold on, I'm a little bit confused now. I thought that it's all one-sided. We heard that from Paula Woodward. We've heard that from John. So what is actually going on here? Did they actually present both sides? Did they present one side or both sides?
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Officials involved in the proceedings repeatedly described it as an investigative grand jury, which is a special kind of grand jury, meaning that it did not confine its investigations to the theory presented to them only by the prosecution. Sorry, I'm a little bit confused. What did John say about it's not an investigative jury?
And that's the whole objective of a grand jury. It's not really an investigative jury.
So it's not an investigative jury, but it is. I mean, officials said that it was. So this is, in my opinion, one of the most glaring falsities presented on Netflix, at least as I understand it. And I think it relies on ignorance and the opacity surrounding the secrecy of these types of legal proceedings. But let's go on. Witnesses known to have testified include, and here we're going to put in bold and in red the Ramsey defense witnesses from this list. Did you know that Burke Ramsey testified, the Ramsey's pilot Mark Archuleta, the Ramsey's pediatrician Dr. Francisco Buff? Now the reason why I've identified him as likely sympathetic to the Ramseys is because we've seen him in documentaries doing exactly that, and his wife doing the same thing. The coroner John Mayer, just based on my understanding, has also been sympathetic to the Ramseys. The Ramsey defense advocate John Douglas, that is a big one. You know, allowing this guy, a profiler, to testify not just the big gun of Lou Smith, but another big gun in John Douglas, that's huge. And so why don't we examine an excerpt from John Douglas talking about his grand jury testimony in his book Law and Disorder. On September 15th, 1998, closing in on 2 years after the murder, a grand jury of 4 women and 8 men began work. Hunter appointed attorney Michael Caine to head its investigation. By that time, Detective Steve Thomas had submitted his resignation, citing disagreements with the police. It's quite strange language that. Detective Steve Thomas submitted his resignation, citing disagreements with the police over how the investigation was being handled. Is that accurate? We've just dealt with his letter. Is that what he said, what he felt, what was going on? And with the district attorney's office for having failed thus far to indict the Ramseys. Anyway, this is the pertinent part. Lou Smith and I both testified before the grand jury, and we were among the last witnesses. He went before the panel on March 11, 1999. My own testimony was heard on April 26th and 27th. Wow, so that is 2 days. Criminal profiler and Team Ramsey employee John Douglas testified in front of the grand jury. Smith had requested that he be allowed to testify, but his participation was rebuffed by the prosecutor Michael Caine. And what happened at the end of the day? Well, he did testify. And I think this is the pertinent part, and this is the part no one ever talks about. Lou Smith testified, John Douglas testified, and the grand jury disagreed with both of them. Now let's go through some of the remaining witnesses. CBI forensics expert Debbie Chavez, CBI fingerprints expert George Herrera, How many of these names do you recognize? Ramsey family friends John and Barbara Fernie, Pam Griffin, Fleet and Priscilla White, Ramsey's housekeeper Linda Hoffman Pugh, and her husband Merv Pugh, Reverend Roll Hoverstock, Burke Ramsey's third grade teacher Carol Pirto, that's an interesting one, handwriting expert Chet Hubowski, as well as at least 2 handwriting experts hired by the Ramsey defense team. And so by inference, what does this tell you about the grand jury and the handwriting aspect? Do you think the grand jurors thought the ransom note was written by an intruder or by one of the Ramseys, specifically one of the Ramseys? And then there were police officers Linda Arndt, Michael Everett, Rick French, Ron Gossage, Jane Harmer, Larry Mason, Fred Patterson, Tom Trujillo, Barry Weiss, and Tom Wickman, but not Detective Steve Thomas. Now, apparently the housekeeper, Linda Hoffman Pugh, who testified before the grand jury, told the Denver Post that during her interactions with them, quote, the grand jury focused almost exclusively on Patsy Ramsey. It's quite interesting, right? That's in terms of her testimony. It was almost all about Patsy, down to the underwear she had purchased from Bloomingdale's. She also said they wanted to know how she related to JONBENET. I felt in my heart they were going to indict Patsy. And in a way, the housekeeper was right. There are also a couple of names missing from this list. I think one of them is Doug Stein, Burke Ramsey's best friend. And didn't Susan Stein testify as well? As well as Susan's husband, Glenn. And it's hard to imagine that they weren't sympathetic to the Ramseys. Also, Fleet White III, Burke Ramsey's friend, also testified. It's unclear whether Ellis Armistead testified. There's a little bit of intrigue that he went in there and then came out a different door, and then the district attorney followed him a couple of minutes later. But if he did, that would be 3 Ramsey investigators. Now, not factual but rumored was the notion that Hunter discussed the decision not to file charges on several occasions before the jury completed its deliberations. And this is from the Ramsey Grand Jury Wiki, and so it should be treated with care. I'll put a link to that in the description. From the same source, another feature that made the grand jury unusual was that District Attorney Hunter allowed several witnesses for the defense, such as Lou Smith and the Ramsey's handwriting analysts, to testify. Well, who do you think the grand jury believed in that case? As well as this, and it's also from the same wiki, which, disclaimer, I've been unable to verify in terms of the exact terms that this was expressed in. Other than that, Governor Romer denied he wanted to replace Hunter with a special prosecutor. Listen to this. Governor Roy Romer, backed by a panel of Colorado district attorneys, informed Alex Hunter that he would be replaced by a special prosecutor if he did not replace his existing Ramsey case attorneys, hire new, more experienced prosecutors, and convene a grand jury. Well, did he consider that? Well, we do know that John's former pal Fleet White wrote to Governor Romer urging him to replace Hunter with a special prosecutor. And Lord knows, wanting to get Hunter off the roadblocked Ramsey case was a sentiment shared by many at the time. On Reddit, I've seen speculation along these lines. Alex Hunter acted to save his job. Is that true, I wonder? Removing the 2 attorneys in charge of the Ramsey case, Peter Hofstrom and Trip DeMuth, and convened a grand jury conducted by Mike Kane. As I'm sure you can appreciate, this is all part of a much longer, more intricate and quite intriguing narrative, but I'm sure you'll agree the narrative around this, just a grand jury thing, is as bananas as the Ramsey ransom note. If you'd like me to share the 7 main thrusts, the 7 pieces of evidence that formed the bulk of the grand jury investigation and of the case presented to the grand jury, please let me know in the comments. I'm not going to take it further than that, but I do want to conclude by dealing with a timeline and one additional thing. You can see the fact that the grand jury trial started in September 1998 and concluded in October 1999. That's 13 months. That indicates it wasn't just the prosecution presenting their case in some one-sided way, as this myth has been perpetuated over and over and over again. It's simply not true. And so rest assured, no unassuming ham sandwiches were harmed or impinged during the grand jury trial. And so I can't help asking, are we being gaslighted by Netflix in terms of the show? As I noted in a previous analysis, the grand jury investigation only happened only received the green light because the governor twisted the district attorney's arm. Netflix implies that this was improper, when the reality is it was highly unusual and more than a little unscrupulous of the DA's office to even be at this point, so far into a case to begin with. If you listen to my reading of Detective Steve Thomas's 7-page, 3,000-word resignation letter with close to 30 references to the DA's office, and thank you if you did listen, and especially if you did listen all the way through, because if you care about true justice, it requires stamina and commitment and discipline and the ability to concentrate and stick with the thing. But above all, it requires the quality of caring, right? Well, then you do get a sense of the scale and scope of the impropriety, the bananas we're dealing with here. I hope you found the rumor control in this analysis enlightening. We'll deal with the merits of the grand jury trial in the next episode. And if you like, we can go into further detail about how Mike Cain felt, how he reacted to Hunter shutting down his insufficient evidence case. We should also look into Boulder Police Chief Mark Beckner's assessment of the case at that time. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.